Let's begin by acknowledging something fundamental. Your energy is not infinite. We often think of fatigue as a physical sensation, but the reality is that it's primarily neurological. Your brain uses energy to make decisions, regulate emotions, and control attention. So wasting energy isn't just inefficient. It creates long-term biological cost. Today, I want to talk about 5 places where people routinely waste their energy, not metaphorically, neurologically, and psychologically. And more importantly, how to reclaim that energy for things that truly move the needle then when people enter arguments, especially in today's world of digital immediacy and public debate. They often do so with a subconscious or overt goal to win, to prove they are right, to defend a position. And while the impulse to assert what we believe is natural, it's important to recognize the biological and cognitive toll this behavior takes when it's not grounded in curiosity or openness. Arguing to win is fundamentally different from discussing to learn. The first is an emotionally charged, high-friction state. The second is calm, receptive, and energy-conserving. The human brain is exquisitely sensitive to social cues, especially those related to status and belonging. Evolutionarily speaking, disagreement has always had stakes. Being outcast from the group or proven wrong could once mean a threat to survival. So when we perceive someone challenging our viewpoint, particularly in public or high-stakes environments, the brain reacts as if it's under attack. The amygdala, a key structure involved in processing threat and fear, becomes active. That sets off a cascade of physiological responses. Heart rate increases, cortisol levels rise, breathing becomes shallow. You're in a stress state, even if the argument is happening in your living room or on your phone. The brain doesn't differentiate well between physical and psychological threat. It just responds. That stress response diverts energy from the parts of the brain involved in complex reasoning and decision-making. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for planning, logic, and impulse control, begins to downregulate when emotional arousal increases. The result? You're not thinking clearly, even though it feels like you are. You're more reactive, less precise, and more likely to double down on your viewpoint than actually evaluate its accuracy. Winning becomes more important than understanding, and when that shift occurs, the interaction stops being productive and starts being metabolically expensive. Arguing to win doesn't just drain the other person. It drains you. It consumes glucose, the primary energy source of the brain. It reduces your attentional bandwidth for the rest of the day. It narrows your focus so aggressively that the brain becomes less capable of absorbing new information or adapting to updated inputs. That's a problem, not only for learning, but for long-term mental agility. When you argue without a willingness to revise or evolve your perspective, you're reinforcing cognitive rigidity. You're training your brain to defend, not to inquire. That's an energetically costly habit to maintain. There's also a neurochemical layer to consider. Winning an argument can feel rewarding. That's because it activates the dopamine system, our brain's reinforcement pathway. But it's a short-term reward. It creates a feedback loop. Win, feel good, seek more of. The problem is that this type of dopamine surge isn't paired with learning or mastery. It's paired with dominance. So over time, the drive becomes about crushing the other point of view, not integrating a more complete one. And because dopamine is part of a system that high is inevitably followed by a low, you need more stimulation to feel satisfied. That means more arguments, more stress, more energy burned. Another often overlooked cost is what it does to your relationships. Arguing to win erodes trust. People sense when you're not listening, when you're waiting for your turn to speak, when you're constructing a counterpoint rather than absorbing what's being said. This subtly shifts the tone of interactions, moving them from connection to competition. And since the brain is wired for social synchrony, this kind of antagonistic energy creates psychological tension, even in nonverbal contexts. That tension, again, takes energy to manage. You walk away from these conversations feeling agitated or exhausted, often without realizing why. If we think about energy, not just in terms of physical stamina, but in terms of cognitive resources, attention, clarity, emotional regulation, then it becomes obvious that misdirected arguments are one of the least efficient ways to spend it. The goal then isn't to avoid disagreement. Disagreement is healthy. often necessary. But the intent must shift. Go into conversations with the objective to understand something you don't already know, not to reaffirm what you already believe. When you do that, you activate curiosity circuits in the brain. These involve a different cocktail of neurotransmitters. Dopamine still plays a role, but so do acetylcholine and norepinephrine, in ways that promote attention and memory consolidation. You actually grow from the interaction instead of shrink into it. In the end, your energy is a currency. Spend it where there is return, on growth, on clarity, on connection. Arguing to win is a poor investment. Let it go, not because you're surrendering, but because you're conserving the most powerful asset you have, your focus. There is a silent energy leak in the mind that few people recognize until it's already taken a toll on their mood, sleep, and ability to focus. It often disguises itself as reflection, but in reality, it's an internal loop that serves no productive function. When you dwell on events from the past, mistakes, regrets, missed opportunities, your brain begins to process those experiences as if they are happening again in real time. This is not metaphorical. This is neurological. The brain has an incredible capacity to simulate experience. That ability is what allows you to plan, visualize, and learn from past behavior. But there's a difference between using memory as a tool and being trapped in it as a cycle. When you revisit the past repeatedly without new insights or resolution, you're not reflecting, you're ruminating. And rumination is not neutral. It is metabolically and emotionally expensive. Your nervous system doesn't distinguish well between a real threat in the environment and a vividly imagined one in your mind. If you sit quietly and think about a moment where you failed or were embarrassed or hurt, your heart rate might go up. Your breathing might tighten. That's because brain regions involved in memory, like the hippocampus, interact closely with emotional processing regions like the amygdala. When that network is activated repeatedly, especially without resolution or regulation, it keeps your system in a low-grade state of stress. That stress doesn't just affect your emotions. It pulls biological resources away from other important functions. Cognitive control, attention span, problem solving, all begin to decline. The brain begins allocating more energy to survival responses and less to creativity or strategic thinking. This is one reason people often feel drained after a period of overthinking, even if they haven't done anything physically demanding. It's because rumination engages neural networks that are energy intensive, especially when they involve strong emotions. There's also an opportunity cost that comes with rumination. Every moment you spend replaying the past is a moment you are not fully present in your life right now. And the more you train your brain to revisit old events automatically, the more you reinforce that neural pathway. It becomes a well-worn trail that your mind travels down, even when you don't intend it. Over time, this can contribute to patterns of low mood, anxiety, and difficulty concentrating, not because of any major external threat, but because the brain is caught in a repetitive loop that it thinks is keeping you safe. What makes this particularly deceptive is that some rumination begins with good intentions. You want to understand what went wrong. You want to avoid making the same mistake again. That drive for insight is not the problem. The problem is when the inquiry turns into fixation. Reflection has a beginning and an end. It involves asking a question, seeking an answer, and applying what you've learned. Rumination loops endlessly without resolution. It keeps asking the same question without accepting the answer, or it keeps replaying the same moment without extracting anything new. When this becomes habitual, it becomes a source of chronic cognitive fatigue. You might find yourself waking up feeling tired even if you've slept, because your mind has been subtly turning over the same emotional content night after night. You may find that your ability to focus during the day is reduced, not because of anything urgent happening in the present, but because part of your attention is still anchored to something that happened months or years ago. That's a heavy load to carry, even if it's invisible to others. The solution isn't to repress the past or pretend it didn't happen. The solution is to relate to it differently, to treat memories as data, not as stories you are obligated to relive. Your brain's ability to revisit the past is a strength, but only if you set boundaries around it. If a memory arises, notice it, examine it if necessary, then return to the present. If insight comes, apply it. If nothing new emerges, let it go. Conservation of mental energy begins with recognizing where it's being spent unconsciously. Rumination can feel like a natural part of being thoughtful, but in truth, it's often a form of mental friction, spinning your wheels without moving forward. The brain performs best when it's not overloaded. Freeing yourself from unnecessary loops isn't just good for your mood. It's essential for your clarity, focus, and long-term well-being. Let the past inform you, not drain you. Let your mind rest where your life is actually happening. In the present, there is a quiet kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from overwork, but from overreach. Specifically, the persistent effort to control what was never yours to command. This type of mental and emotional strain is subtle because it often hides behind the appearance of responsibility or diligence. But in truth, it is a misallocation of energy with measurable consequences on your nervous system, cognition, and emotional health. When you spend time and effort trying to manipulate or influence outcomes that are ultimately beyond your reach, the body responds as if it's dealing with an immediate threat. This may sound like an exaggeration, but the biological processes make it very real. The nervous system is organized to protect you. It scans for unpredictability, monitors your environment, and constantly asks one core question: are you in control of what's happening around you? The more uncertainty it detects, the more your internal resources shift toward vigilance. This vigilance activates what's known as the sympathetic nervous system, your body's stress response pathway. You don't have to be running from danger for this system to light up. Just sitting and worrying about whether someone will respond the way you hope, whether an event will unfold in your favor, whether the future will look the way you envision, all of that is enough to cause physiological changes. Your heart rate increases, digestion slows, your muscles hold tension, and your brain narrows its attention. So these are evolutionary responses to perceived instability, and they are not designed to be sustained over long periods of time. When you chronically try to manage situations or people that exist outside your control, your internal systems remain in a heightened state of arousal. The brain consumes more glucose, more oxygen, and begins to fatigue faster. And unlike acute stress, such as lifting weights or solving a short-term challenge, this kind of stress provides no healthy return. You're not adapting, you're burning out. The feedback loop is frustrating. The more you try to control things, the more resistance you meet. The more resistance you feel, the more effort you apply. And the more effort you apply without reward, the more depleted you become. Eventually, this creates a mismatch between perceived effort and actual outcomes, which is one of the hallmarks of emotional fatigue. Control feels safe. That's why so many people reach for it, even when it's illusory. It creates the impression of order, even when the reality is chaos. But the cost of that illusion is significant. It trains the mind to stay in high alert mode. It keeps you in a posture of micromanaging everything and everyone, including your own emotional responses. This doesn't lead to mastery. It leads to rigidity. And cognitive rigidity is a risk factor for anxiety, depression, and reduced performance over time. Your mind needs flexibility to respond to change. But when you constantly try to lock everything into place, you lose that adaptability. There's also the issue of focus. Your attention is a finite resource. When you give it to matters outside your influence, what others think of you, how people behave, outcomes you can't dictate, you're giving away energy that could be used to refine your own skills, your own reactions, your own habits. Trying to control other people's reactions, decisions, or feelings is not only ineffective, it's a direct path to chronic dissatisfaction. People are not predictable variables in a formula. They are living, changing systems with their own motivations, histories, and chemistry. To believe you can control that, even with the best intentions, is to take on a burden the nervous system is not designed to carry. This doesn't mean you stop caring or that you withdraw from effort. It means you learn to distinguish between where your energy can make a difference and where it cannot. You can influence outcomes by showing up prepared, by communicating clearly, by maintaining consistency. But influence is not control. And once you understand the line between the two, your energy can finally begin to stabilize. The nervous system relaxes. The prefrontal cortex re-engages. You return to a state of cognitive clarity and emotional resilience. You feel less drained, not because your environment changed, but because your relationship to uncertainty shifted. Letting go of control is not a passive act. It is an active neurological and psychological reorientation. It tells your brain that uncertainty is not necessarily danger, that not everything unknown requires your full stress response. And when that shift happens, energy is no longer wasted in resistance. It becomes available again for focus, for creativity, for connection, and for growth. The moment you stop trying to control the uncontrollable is the moment you regain access to your full cognitive potential. That's not surrender, that's strategy. There is a common misconception that doing multiple things at once is a sign of efficiency or intelligence. In reality, the brain is not designed to handle multiple high-focus tasks simultaneously. What we call multitasking is, in most cases, task switching. It's the rapid shifting of attention from one activity to another, often within seconds, and sometimes without full awareness. While this may create a surface-level sense of productivity, what actually happens under the hood, neurologically and biologically, is a repeated interruption of deep focus that results in cognitive fatigue, poor retention, and reduced performance. The brain's ability to focus on something is not passive. It takes effort. Neural networks in the prefrontal cortex and parietal regions must coordinate to maintain attention on a single target. This coordination requires metabolic energy, primarily in the form of glucose and oxygen. Every time you pull your attention away from one task and redirect it to another, your brain has to disengage one network and activate another. That switch is not instantaneous. It costs time, but more importantly, it costs energy. The switch itself can take anywhere from a fraction of a second to several seconds, depending on the complexity of the tasks involved. But what's less visible is the cognitive residue left behind. When you move from one task to another, your brain often holds on to fragments of the first task while trying to engage with the second. This overlap creates mental interference. It reduces clarity, increases error rates, and slows down both comprehension and execution. You may feel like you're getting more done, but what's really happening is a drop in quality across all fronts. This constant toggling between tasks also impacts working memory, the short-term system your brain uses to hold and manipulate information. Working memory, when you try to split it across competing demands, it becomes overloaded, forcing the brain to drop or forget information more frequently. This is why people who multitask often experience lapses in recall unfinished thoughts and difficulty retaining what they've just read or heard. It's not a lack of intelligence. It's a bandwidth issue. There's a physiological layer to this as well. Multitasking elevates arousal levels, not necessarily in a good way. It keeps the sympathetic nervous system slightly activated. You may not feel full-blown stress, but there's a kind of subtle agitation in the system. Your breathing becomes more shallow, your posture more tense, your blinking rate increases. These are microsigns that your nervous system is not fully relaxed. Over time, this contributes to cumulative fatigue. Even if you don't feel exhausted in the moment, the brain will start to show signs of wear, decreased impulse control, slower reaction times, and reduced emotional regulation. What makes multitasking so insidious is that it often doesn't feel difficult. In fact, it can feel stimulating, even addictive. The brain's novelty circuits are engaged each time a new task or input arrives. That small spike of dopamine gives the illusion of momentum. It creates a feedback loop. Switch tasks, feel a momentary lift, switch again, repeat. But this stimulation doesn't lead to progress. It fragments attention and leaves behind a kind of mental clutter that can linger even after you stop working. The long-term cost of this pattern is not just reduced performance. It's a blunted capacity to engage in deep work. The kind of focus that allows for creative insight, problem solving, and mastery requires time to build. It takes several minutes of uninterrupted attention for the brain to reach its optimal zone for sustained effort. If that zone is broken every few minutes by emails, messages, or inner impulses to check another app, the brain never fully gets there. The result is a life lived in shallow focus, never quite reaching the mental depths where meaningful progress happens. Recovering from this habit doesn't require dramatic lifestyle changes. It starts with understanding what attention really is, a limited, trainable, and extremely valuable form of energy. When you direct it in too many directions at once, you dilute it. When you protect it, you amplify it. The goal is not to eliminate responsiveness or flexibility, but to stop scattering your mental resources across inputs that don't deserve them. The more your attention is pulled, the less capacity you have for precision, insight, and creative flow. Reclaiming that capacity doesn't mean doing less. It means doing one thing at a time, fully with your entire brain present. That's where real efficiency lives. There is a kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from lack of sleep or overexertion. It comes from pretending, specifically from the ongoing effort of presenting yourself in a way that doesn't match how you actually think, feel, or want to behave. This effort, when sustained over time, becomes a subtle but significant drain on your cognitive and emotional resources. Nowhere is this more evident than in relationships where authenticity is not allowed to exist fully. These are the connections where you constantly monitor what you say, how you say it, what you reveal, and what you hide. And although this may seem like a form of social intelligence or self-protection, the long-term cost on your nervous system and sense of well-being is considerable. The brain is wired for social interaction. There are entire neural networks dedicated to reading facial expressions, interpreting tone, and predicting the reactions of others. These systems are highly sensitive to cues of approval, rejection, safety, and threat. When you are around people where you feel free to be yourself, without filtering or calculation, your nervous system remains in a state of relative calm. Your breathing is steady, your heart rate remains stable, and your emotional regulation becomes easier. This is not just an abstract feeling of comfort. It is a real physiological state in which your stress systems stay quiet and your brain conserves energy for higher level functions. But when you find yourself in relationships where psychological safety is absent, where you cannot express your thoughts honestly, or where you feel that being yourself will lead to judgment or exclusion, the body moves into a guarded state. Subtle though it may be, this form of social stress triggers the release of stress hormones like cortisol. The sympathetic nervous system becomes activated. Even if you're sitting quietly in conversation, your internal environment behaves as if you're preparing for a challenge or a threat. This activation is costly. It redirects energy from rest, digestion, creativity, and deep cognitive processing toward vigilance and self-monitoring. Over time, these repeated microstress events accumulate. You may find yourself feeling emotionally tired after social events. You might leave certain conversations replaying everything you said, wondering how you came across, or second-guessing whether you were too much, not enough, or somehow out of sync. This mental replay is a form of internal conflict, and it requires energy. The energy you spend managing your image is energy you cannot spend being present, curious, or connected. Inauthenticity also impacts the brain's reward systems. When you're accepted or affirmed for a version of yourself that isn't fully real, it doesn't feel satisfying. It might bring temporary relief, but it rarely brings true fulfillment. That's because the dopamine system, the one responsible for motivation and reinforcement, is sensitive to alignment. When your actions, words, and internal values are in sync, the reward feels integrated. When they're not, it feels hollow. You may receive validation, but it doesn't land. Over time, this can lead to a subtle detachment from relationships, even if they appear successful on the surface. Another issue with inauthentic relationships is that they limit emotional regulation. When you feel safe around someone, your brain's mirror neuron systems engage more fully. These systems help you co-regulate, meaning you can borrow calm from someone else when you're activated and offer calm in return. But when you're masking or filtering yourself, this connection doesn't occur. The relationship becomes a performance rather than a shared experience. That's not only isolating, it's energetically expensive. You're doing all the emotional labor alone, without the support of a tuned interaction. The cost of maintaining these relationships isn't always obvious in the short term. But over weeks, months, and years, it can manifest as burnout, low mood, social anxiety, or a sense of disconnection, even in crowded rooms. What's more, it reinforces a narrative in your own mind that your real self is too risky to show. That belief can quietly influence how you show up in other areas of life, your work, your creativity, your goals. When you suppress your authenticity in one domain, your nervous system generalizes the pattern. It becomes harder to trust your instincts, to act spontaneously, or to speak with conviction. You don't need every relationship to be deeply vulnerable or emotionally exposed, but you do need somewhere the filter can come off, where there is no scoreboard, where you're not calculating your every word. These are the relationships that restore your energy rather than drain it. They regulate your physiology, anchor your attention, and remind your nervous system what safety feels like. The less time and energy you spend performing, the more you have available for real presence, real creativity, and real connection. The work of letting go of inauthentic bonds is not always easy, but it is one of the most powerful ways to restore clarity and calm to your internal world. You stop being split between who you are and who you're trying to be. That unification is not just psychological, it's physiological, and it's freeing.